Nuclear power, dirty, dangerous, expensive. Next on Enviro Close Up. Welcome to Enviro Close Up. I'm Karl Grossman. The subject, nuclear power, dirty, dangerous, expensive. And I get those words from a brochure put out by an organization called Beyond Nuclear. Here is the brochure. Again, dirty, dangerous, expensive. The brochure adds on its cover, the verdict is in on nuclear power. With me is Kevin Camps, who works for Beyond Nuclear. Let's amplify on television the points made in this brochure.
Well, dirty, dangerous, and expensive is a good way to remember the different problems with nuclear power. So dirty, it's radioactively polluting at every step of the way, from uranium mining to milling to processing to enrichment to use of the uranium fuel in reactors, and then the radioactive waste dumps that come after that. So in a sense, it's dirty forever. Because, for example, at the Yucca Mountain dump site proposal in Nevada, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency recognizes 1 million years of regulation are required at Yucca Mountain. So 1 million years of radiological hazard recognized by the federal government. And that's actually not the whole story, because there are radioactive poisons. Just one would be iodine-129, which has a 15.7 million year half-life. Then you got to multiply by 10 to get the hazardous persistence. That's 157 million years. So EPA is only willing to recognize 1 million years of hazard. That's the dirtiness of nuclear power. But it starts right at the very beginning with the uranium mines, which oftentimes are located on Native American land in this country, indigenous peoples' lands in places like Australia or Niger in West Africa. So dangerous. What's dangerous about nuclear power? Well, the risks of accidents or attacks unleashing catastrophic amounts of radioactivity. So the worst accident in the history of commercial nuclear power happened at Chernobyl in the Ukraine in 1986. And 200 tons of radioactive fuel first exploded and then burned for 10 days. Not only the fuel, but the core of the facility was made out of graphite, and they couldn't put the fire out. And that radioactivity was blown sky high, and then it fell out over Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. About 50% of the radioactivity fell out in those three countries. The other 50% went around the world. It fell out over Europe. We got fallout here in the United States. So that's a part of the danger of a severe catastrophic accident. Another part of the danger with nuclear power is that wherever it goes, nuclear weapons can also go. So the International Atomic Energy Agency at the United Nations recognizes that 40 countries in the world, if they chose to, could become nuclear weapons powers in very short order. And how would they do it? They would do it with their nuclear power technology. We've already seen this take place. India did this in 1974, just as one example. So that's another danger of nuclear power, is the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And sort of a hybrid of those dangers, the dangers of accidents and weaponry, would be the risk of a terrorist attack upon a nuclear power plant in this country. Unfortunately, the waste that's generated at nuclear power plants takes that natural uranium, passes it through the reactor core, and makes it 1 million times more radioactive than it was as fresh fuel. And then that waste is stored in indoor pools of water. Those have filled at most nuclear power plants now. They're packed to the gills, and they've gone to this outdoor storage in silos of concrete and steel, the overflow parking for high-level radioactive waste. Unfortunately, these waste storage facilities are vulnerable to attack. Especially certain reactor designs have pools that are several stories up in the air and share pool walls with the outside of the facility. And there's a report from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission which shows that if the pool water is drained, it would only take a matter of hours at most before the waste would spontaneously combust, and you would have an accident much worse than Chernobyl. because Chernobyl was 200 tons of nuclear fuel. Some of the pools in the country have several-fold more quantity of high-level radioactive waste in them than that. And even these outdoor silos were never designed to withstand a terrorist attack. So that's another danger. And the expensive part, you could not come up with a more expensive way to boil water, because that's what nuclear power does. It boils water, it makes steam, the steam turns a turbine and makes electricity. It's very expensive. The price tag on a new atomic reactor in this country, and this comes from the chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, he said a good ballpark number is $10 billion. Well, it's going up from there. It's skyrocketing as we speak. And that's just one step of the uranium fuel chain. There's also the mining, the milling. All of those facilities are hugely expensive, so expensive that Wall Street will not touch this industry. It will not risk its money on atomic energy. The only way that this is going to happen is if taxpayers pick up the tab.
The Price-Anderson Act, what is it? What does it mean?
The Price-Anderson Act was enacted in 1957, which was a big year for commercial nuclear power in this country. The first commercial reactor was fired up at Shippingport, Pennsylvania in 1957, and the U.S. federal government had to make two big promises to the industry to get the utility companies to go into nuclear. They had to agree to take care of the liability for catastrophic accidents. That was the Price-Anderson Act. And at the same time, they had to promise the utility companies that the federal government would take care of the high-level radioactive waste. All of these promises were made way back in the 50s. What Price-Anderson does is it caps the liability that the atomic industry and its insurance providers would have to pay in the aftermath of a catastrophic accident. And the current level right now is $10.4 billion. That's what the atomic industry as a whole and its insurance providers would have to pay after an accident anywhere in the country at any one of these nuclear power plants. So any amount of property damages above that would be taxpayers paying for it. And if you look at Chernobyl, in the first 10 years after Chernobyl, $350 billion of damages paid by Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. That was in the first 10 years. We're almost 25 years on now after Chernobyl, so add hundreds of billions onto that figure. That's what we're looking at in the United States. If there's a major accident, we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars of property damages, easily. And most of that would be paid by taxpayers.
The brochure, Dirty, Dangerous, and Expensive, speaks of the Crack 2 report involving catastrophic accidents. What is that about?
The Crack 2, it stands for Calculations of Reactor Accident Consequences. That's the crack part. It was a study that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission commissioned. They had a nuclear lab at the national level carry out the study, and then they tried to bury the study because the results were so catastrophic. So you name the reactor in the country, they looked at what peak early fatalities would look like, peak early injuries, latent cancer fatalities, property damages. And again, depending on which reactor, you're talking thousands, sometimes even hundreds of thousands of deaths were predicted downwind of a major accident at a nuclear power plant. And the damages, the property damages, in the hundreds of billions of dollars. It just showed how bad it could be. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission tried to conceal the study from the public, but Congressman Ed Markey in 1982 forced the agency to release the report. And it's the most recent report on this subject that's been done by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. We're very wary right now because they're attempting to update Crack 2 with a new study, and we're very fearful that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which is very much captured by the industry that it's supposed to regulate, will come out with a whitewash that really the Crack 2 was flawed. All of the projections of deaths and injuries and property damages were greatly exaggerated, and really it's nothing to worry about. We should build a new generation of reactors. That's our fear, is that the NRC is up to that.
Another point in the brochure is you don't need a catastrophic accident for the radioactivity to get to people. What's that process?
Well, routine radiation releases from every stage of the uranium fuel chain take place, but at the reactors especially. Like I said, the uranium fuel becomes 1 million times more radioactive when it passes through a reactor for several years. there are leaks in these fuel rods. So the primary coolant water becomes contaminated. Some of it gets filtered out, but there are leaks in the system. And so the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, again, grants permits to utilities to discharge radioactivity on a routine basis into the water, because all of the nuclear power plants are located on water for cooling purposes. Well, they're also taking advantage of their location on water to dump radioactivity into the river, the lake, the ocean, where they're located. And another pathway for routine radiation releases is into the air. They have atmospheric discharges. And this is somewhat different and more shocking, in a sense, than even the leaks that are going on at these old plants like Vermont Yankee. They're having very serious and large-scale leaks of tritium, which is radioactive hydrogen, into the groundwater and then into the Connecticut River. Well, where was that tritium going to when it leaked? It was being discharged on a routine basis with permission from the U.S. federal government. So yes, it does become more concentrated when it leaks into groundwater. But the whole philosophy of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the nuclear power industry is dilution is the solution to pollution. They were going to dump it directly into the air and into the Connecticut River in the first place. And people living downstream are being exposed to these radiation doses. And the National Academy of Sciences, for decades now, has repeated their finding that any exposure to radioactivity carries a health risk, no matter how low the exposure, and that the risks are cumulative, that the risks go up the more you're exposed.
What about the so-called success of the French nuclear program?
Well, there's a lot of myths surrounding the French nuclear program. The U.S. nuclear establishment loves to point to France, and they say the French have figured everything out. They get 80% of their electricity from nuclear power. But what are some of these myths? One of the myths, and again, the chairman of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission has said himself that the idea, the notion that the French have solved their radioactive waste problem is one of the best myths out there. That's a quote. He said that. And it is a myth, actually, because what the French do is they reprocess high-level radioactive waste. They extract plutonium, supposedly to reuse as reactor fuel. That program has largely fallen apart at huge expense to French ratepayers and taxpayers. They're sitting on a mountain of separated plutonium in France, which is weapons usable. They have to guard that plutonium supply 24/7, very carefully, because just a small quantity of that plutonium could be used for a nuclear weapon. So they have to secure the separated plutonium. In addition, they discharge a lot of radioactivity into the air and into the ocean. They have an underwater pipeline into the English Channel, and they dump 100 million gallons of radioactively contaminated liquids every year into the ocean. It's traveled as far as the Canadian Arctic, and it's contaminated the seafood supply. So there's a dozen European countries outraged by this practice. And the gaseous releases from the French reprocessing facility are quite startling as well, especially gases like krypton, radioactive krypton. In a single year's operations at the Le Hague reprocessing facility in France, more radioactive krypton is released than all of the atomic weapons blasts from the 1940s through the 1960s. And another radioactive gas released from reprocessing is carbon-14, radioactive carbon-14, which has a 5,000-year half-life. So you multiply the half-life by 10 for the hazardous persistence, 50,000 years of hazard. So nuclear power is pointed to as a solution to carbon dioxide releases. Well, the nuclear fuel chain releases carbon, and it happens to be radioactive. Radioactive carbon-14, one of the most hazardous of the radioactive isotopes, because it will integrate into living tissues, including in humans, where it will deliver its radiation dose. And the same can be said of tritium, this radioactive form of hydrogen, which can integrate down to the most intimate levels in the human biology, right down to the DNA molecule. And that's why it can initiate cancer, genetic damage, birth defects.
What about the issue of global warming and the claim that nuclear power doesn't contribute to global warming, doesn't emit greenhouse gases?
Well, the industry would like people to think that there are zero greenhouse gas emissions from the nuclear power industry. It's not true. There are greenhouse gas emissions, especially the front end of the nuclear fuel chain is very energy intensive, Most of that energy is fossil fuels, from the mining and the milling to the processing, and then especially the enrichment of uranium. 2 uranium enrichment facilities in the United States operated from the 1950s really up until the present day. One of them is still operating, using 2 coal-fired power plants at each of these uranium facilities. Every watt of electricity from this dirty coal that was being burned was being used to enrich uranium. It was 1% of the electricity usage in the United States for decades on end. And in addition, it was a huge releaser of ozone layer destroying chlorofluorocarbons. So there are these greenhouse gas emissions, there's ozone destroying chemicals released, but some of the other reasons that nuclear cannot solve the climate crisis is the astronomical expense of nuclear power. Reducing greenhouse gases with energy efficiency is 10 times more cost effective than new atomic reactors in the United States. Renewable sources of electricity, like wind power, are very cost competitive with nuclear at this point. Wind is coming down dramatically in price, and this is reflected by the major expansion in wind power. Just last year in the United States, 7,000 megawatts of new wind was installed. How much nuclear was installed? 0% was installed. And you can go back for 30 years and have very little nuclear power coming online, while wind is growing by leaps and bounds. And even solar technology is coming down dramatically in price. Probably in a few years' time, solar centralized facilities will be cost competitive with nuclear. And this is very remarkable because nuclear power, just like fossil fuels, has enjoyed the lion's share of public support for decades on end, whereas wind and solar have gotten the crumbs, if that. So despite the disparity in subsidies, renewables are competitive and actually out-competing nuclear power.
Sometimes Patrick Moore, he was involved years ago with Greenpeace, is pointed to as an example of some environmentalists now embracing nuclear power. What do you respond to that?
Well, Patrick Moore himself has gotten a lot of media attention, unfortunately. The question is never asked, or very rarely asked, why are you doing this? And he will answer the question if asked, and it's because he's being paid by the Nuclear Energy Institute. His organization is a front group for the Nuclear Energy Institute, and he will readily admit that that's the case. So he's being paid very likely a handsome salary for what he's doing. And in fact, he has done very similar work, if you can call it that, for other polluting industries, from genetically modified organisms to clear-cut timber practices. You name it, pesticides, he's willing to sell out for it. And he uses his past Greenpeace affiliation as his selling point. The truth is that if you look at the hundreds and even thousands of environmental organizations from the grassroots level to the national level, international level, in the world and in the United States, the vast majority, almost to a single group, is very skeptical, if not outright opposed to nuclear power. So it's a myth that environmentalists are embracing nuclear power. Quite the opposite.
On the 1986 Chernobyl accident, there are some who say that, well, that was an old Soviet design, and that's the problem, not nuclear power.
Well, the United States has had some problems of its own. 3 Mile Island, of course, in 1979 was a 50% meltdown with serious radioactivity releases. We've had some close calls in recent years. Fortunately, there was not a meltdown or a large-scale radioactivity release, but we came very close. Davis-Besse, near Toledo, Ohio, a massive corrosion hole in the lid of the reactor. 7 inches of steel were eaten away by acid. All that was left was 3/16 of an inch of stainless steel liner. It was very close to breaching, which would have led to a loss of coolant accident with the potential for a meltdown of the core. And if the meltdown went through the foundations of the facility and into the groundwater, then it would have been a catastrophic radioactivity release on the shoreline of Lake Erie. And we've had other near misses. Indian Point Nuclear Power Plant in the year 2000 had a steam generator tube burst. The danger there is you could take out a lot of tubes all at the same time, like a domino effect. And again, a loss of coolant accident in the core. At that point, you're risking a meltdown and a release of huge amounts of deadly radioactivity onto the wind, onto the water. And we have close calls all too often, unfortunately. Just last weekend, I mean, you choose the day, and there's going to be something happening in the nuclear industry. Well, just last weekend, for the anniversary of 3 Mile Island, there were a series of fires around the country at nuclear power plants. One that burned for 5 hours at the Robinson Nuclear Power Plant in South Carolina. And apparently there was some significant damage done to cables in that facility. So if you burn the wrong cable at a nuclear power plant, you could lose control of the core. And again, another accident was at Browns Ferry, Alabama in 1975, a severe fire that burned out of control for hours, and it did burn safety-related cabling systems. They lost control of the one reactor, and through sheer luck, it was shut down and didn't melt down. Despite this incredible accident, fire protection at nuclear power plants is next to non-existent. And this is almost 35 years after the Browns Ferry fire. We still do not have basic fire protections at nuclear power plants.
The nuclear industry claims that nuclear plants could withstand like a 9/11 terrorist attack, an airplane hitting a plant or the spent fuel pool at the plant. How do you view that claim?
The nuclear power industry is very good at half-truths, and what they tried to do with that scenario is show the containment building around the reactor, which is the most robust part of a nuclear power plant. There's some question whether these steel and concrete containment buildings could or could not withstand such an aerial attack of a crashing airliner. But there are soft spots in nuclear power plants. The control room many times is outside of containment. The pool of water holding the high-level radioactive waste is oftentimes outside of containment. The electrical transmission switchyard is out in the open. There are so many different ways that a nuclear power plant could be melted down or a large-scale release of radioactivity could be initiated. And in that sense, nuclear power plants are pre-deployed weapons of mass destruction, just waiting to be detonated. They're sitting ducks, they're very vulnerable. And there have been so many security breaches at nuclear power plants before September 11th and after September 11th. They're going on now, as we speak. Sleeping security guards at the Peach Bottom nuclear power plant. Security guards being fired for trying to do their job, for trying to call attention to breaches. They're fired for doing the right thing, and the breach is covered up. So we have one of the biggest threats to our national security are the nuclear power plants and the radioactive waste storage taking place there, located across our country.
With nuclear power being indeed so dirty, dangerous, and expensive, and the verdict being in, why the push? There's 104 nuclear plants in the U.S. There's now this drive to double that number, to, they call it revive nuclear power. This is what the nuclear industry calls it. Like, why?
Well, for the industry, a relapse into nuclear power puts dollar signs in their eyes. They love the money they make at this industry. Of course, all of the costs and the risks are borne by taxpayers, ratepayers, and the public, so they pocket the profits. And a typical figure for net profits at an operating nuclear power plant, a ballpark figure, is $1 million a day in net profits from electricity sales. So when you have none of the costs or risks and all of the profits, then you're really into that. And that's why it has to be stopped, because this is an industry that's out of control. It gives a whole new meaning to the term moral hazard from economics, because this is a moral hazard with not only financial risks, but radiological risks associated with it. And of course, this money grab at the U.S. Treasury for all these subsidies to build the new generation of atomic reactors, there'd be no skin in the game whatsoever by this private industry.
With every U.S. administration since nuclear technology began in the late 40s for it. I mean, even now, Barack Obama talking about clean, safe nuclear power and promoting a loan guarantee program of billions of dollars. How can it be stopped?
Well, the American people are the ones who are going to have to stop it, and we're seeing that all across the country. Most of the 36 new reactors that are in progress at this point are targeted at the southeastern United States. And that was very strategic too. Places with operating reactors were mostly targeted because those local governments have been bought off already with tax revenues from these facilities. There's a workforce at those plants that also raises support levels in the local area. But there are groups in the southeast and across the country that are fighting these new facilities, that are shining a spotlight on the environmental injustices associated with reactors and waste dumps. So the fight is on, and people can plug into the fight. There are many great groups working this issue. People could get involved. It's really important that folks contact their members of Congress, both of their senators and their representative, and say to them that the nuclear power industry has to financially stand on its own 2 feet in the free marketplace. No more subsidies. They've already gotten hundreds of billions of dollars of our money in the past 50 years, and now they are asking for perhaps $1 trillion of our money. So folks need to stop the next bailout before it happens, because these are preemptive bailouts for the nuclear power industry.
How can people connect with Beyond Nuclear?
Well, our website is www.beyondnuclear.org, and you've got a wide variety of informational sites right there at our homepage. And our phone number is area code 301-270-2209, and we'd be happy to help folks fight nuclear facilities or proposed ones in their neck of the woods.
Now, Beyond Nuclear rather uniquely connects nuclear power, you were talking about it before, in fact, to nuclear weapons.
The simple truth is, wherever nuclear power goes, nuclear weapons are a half step behind. Once a country has nuclear power facilities, they can choose to direct them into a nuclear weapons program. And the pathways for that are uranium enrichment, like the Hiroshima bomb was a uranium bomb during World War II. And it's the whole issue with Iran is the Iranian regime is saying, no, this is peaceful nuclear electricity we're pursuing. That's why we're enriching uranium, for fuel for our reactors. Whereas others are suspicious that uranium enrichment might actually be for making weapons. Well, that can happen anywhere in the world where uranium enrichment takes place. So the International Atomic Energy Agency recognizes 40 countries that could go nuclear in terms of weapons based on their nuclear power programs. And the other pathway to the bomb is reprocessing of radioactive waste. When you extract plutonium, it is now weapons usable. And that's how the Nagasaki bomb was manufactured and designed, was a plutonium bomb. So it's very dangerous to spread nuclear power technology. And there was even a congressional commission that agreed with this position, that nuclear power subsidies, even here in the United States, are giving a green light to such subsidies in other countries. And once you've built uranium enrichment or reprocessing facilities, you can use them for weapons purposes. So there's recognition at the federal level that this is the case. Unfortunately, the Obama administration is going the other way.
Kevin Camps of Beyond Nuclear. Check out its website, www.beyondnuclear.org. You've been watching Enviro Close Up. I'm Karl Grossman. For a copy of this or any Enviro Close Up, just go to our website, www.envirovideo.com. Thank you for watching.